Hello, everyone. This is David Madison, the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, and I'm joined today by our Director of Professional Development, Mary Catherine Duffy. Hello, Mary Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
Well, we're talking about vital signs today, so let's go ahead and get the slides started, and let's get right to it. So, the SAES vital signs. This is a document. We're going to talk a little bit about the possible uses, but first, let me tell you where it physically lives. So, it lives on our website. If you go to the website in the document library under general documents, you'll see a link for the SAES school vital signs. So, you may want to hit pause and pull that document up right now because I'm going to make references to it throughout the webinar today. So what are they? Well, a couple of different ways to think about vital signs. So when you think about the different expectations that are placed on schools, one way to look at it is through this triangle. So at the foundation, we have what we call state compliance. So these are licensing, basic compliance relating to school operations. Those are the things that everyone has to be aware of and comply with, just to make sure the place is safe and operating at the most fundamental level of an Episcopal school. On top of that, we have what's called accreditation. Accreditation deals with standards. So standards are the different aspects of your program that have to be true in order for you to maintain your accreditation standard. So it's one level higher than what the state expects. It gets a little more specific. It's not for every school. It's for those schools that really want to be recognized as understanding what excellence means and understanding what continuous improvement means. And again, accreditation is all about standards. What are these standards that have been articulated by the association? On top of that, we have something called vital signs. Vital signs are not required, but vital signs are characteristics that high-performing schools share. So if you are an accredited school, for example, and you're interested in understanding, okay, we're accredited, but what's the next level? What are some things that really, really awesome schools share as hallmarks? We've compiled those into a document that we call the vital signs. That gives you an idea of what we're talking about. We like vital signs because think of your blood pressure. The perfect blood pressure. What's the perfect blood pressure, Mary Catherine? Is it like 120 over
Oh,
80?
yeah, 115 over something like that.
Something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. So that would be the vital sign. Now, is our blood pressure always 120 over 80?
No.
No, 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 no. Particularly in the midst of the pandemic, I suspect our blood pressure has been a little bit higher than
For
120
sure.
over 80. And so 120 over 80, that's the vital sign we want to see. But what I want to make clear is just because your blood pressure isn't 120 over 80 all the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the school is sick. Does that make sense? What it
Yeah.
means is it could be an area for improvement. If your blood pressure is 250 over 120 for an extended period of time, well, sure, that's not sustainable. But the vital signs are that idea of what's the ideal, what's the goal that we want to hit. They're aspirational. So as we're going through some of these, there may be some elements that you recognize in your program. There may be some elements that you're like, oh wow, we need to work on that. All that's fine. So Mary
Yeah.
Catherine, anything to add on that?
Well, I'm just thinking about how it's a little bit like when we go to the doctor for a full checkup, and we may find that the blood pressure is great and certain parts of your checkup turn out great, but some parts you're like, oh, that's kind of a problem. So this isn't just about one thing in particular, one vital sign in particular. It's about looking at the whole picture of your school versus like you look at the whole picture of your health.
Right.
And there are going to be some things that you go, yeah, we've got to work on that, but other things are fine. And I think that it's important not to get too focused on one particular thing and think that is the example of health for the whole.
Yeah.
For the whole. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I mean, aspirational. These are things that we want. Now, again, if we go through and your school doesn't have any of these, then that could be an indicator as well. But don't get too fixated on one over the whole list, if that makes sense. So let's talk about how you may want to use these. Here are some examples of how schools have used these before successfully. So before a school goes into strategic planning, that's a great time to pull the vital sign document out and just do a little bit of a self-assessment. When you're working through the vital signs and holding your school up to the vital signs, there may be one or two things that come from that conversation that would really inform strategic planning. So that's one way to use the document. Another way to use the document is in the annual goal setting for the head or the board. If you're kind of thinking through where do we want to focus our energy this year, and maybe you've got a couple of areas identified, or maybe you're just not exactly sure. This document can really help with that. Pull that document out, read it through, hold it up to your school, and figure out if there are any areas where we really want to say, we want to get better at this particular thing this year. That may be an indication that would be a great annual goal, either for your head of school or for your board. Another way to use this document is if you want to do an internal analysis before a large decision or something like a big project. So maybe before a capital campaign. I've used this document in conversations with schools that want to do an expansion of their program. So for example, maybe you want to expand the grade you're offering, or maybe you want to expand the number of sections you're offering. Before you do an expansion, it makes a ton of sense to make sure that everything is fundamentally sound. And so that's another way to use this document as well. So let's talk about how they're organized. So when you take a look at the document, I view them as being organized in a handful of different areas. Now, we don't have these section headings, for example, in the document, but really, if we're at 12 o'clock, it talks about marketing and enrollment, talks about the facility, it talks about the program, it talks about advancement, talks about governance, and then financial management. So those are the different subjects that we address. And so what I thought we'd do today is just take a look at a couple of those sections, and then look at a couple of the vital signs, and then do a deeper analysis of one particular vital sign in each area. So for example, let's start with the vital signs and talk about professional staff. Here are 4 examples. Vital sign number 1, which is going to be the one that we look at in a little more detail, talks about faculty salaries. And that's not a mistake that it's the very first vital sign. We believe that the most important part of a strong Episcopal school has to do with awesome, engaged faculty members. And one way to make sure that you have awesome, engaged faculty members is that you're paying competitive salaries. We can talk about the ethical piece of that and why there's a moral obligation to do that. But at the core, in a very fundamental way, we want you to be able to attract the best people to work with the students in your school. What we have found from a vital signs perspective is that really high performing schools are within the 85 to 90% range of what the local ISD pays. Now, you don't have to pay dollar for dollar of the local ISD, we have found, because Episcopal schools tend to be awesome environments that faculty want to serve in. However, you can't pay, if what you are paying is less than about 85% of what a teacher could get at the local ISD, that can become a challenge. We're going to come back to this in a little more detail. I'm going to show you the exact verbatim language of the vital sign. So hold that thought. Let's take a look at number 2, which is professional development. So professional development, the vital sign is that a significant investment of the annual budget goes towards making sure your faculty has opportunities for professional development. We don't have a specific number in the vital sign. However, everyone asks, well, what is a significant investment? Short answer is that's a very individualized question based on your enrollment, your financial situation. Do you have an endowment? All sorts of things. NAIS will say that the average spend on professional development for faculty tends to be about 1.5% to 2% of your total expenses. So if you feel like you really need a benchmark, you can use that as a benchmark. But I think also that's a moving target because as a result of COVID, we're finding so many opportunities for rich professional development that don't involve travel expenses.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that 1.5 to 2% benchmark will change, will stay. I don't know. But internally, you need to ask, are we putting forth the significant investment of our annual budget and making sure our faculty are doing what they need to do to be strong?
Right.
Instructional practices, that's the vital sign number 6 that also relates to professional staff. What are you doing with regard to current best educational practices? So specifically in the area of differentiated instruction, assessment, and technology. Now, again, this is a moving target right now because so many of our schools are involved in distance learning. We all had a bit of a crash course in using technology and distance learning in our instructional practice. So this is a vital sign that everyone is getting their arms around. And then finally, vital sign number 7 talks about the administrative staff. We don't have a specific number. We don't require that there be certain positions. So for example, one frequent question is, well, how large does a school need to be before it needs to explore an assistant headmaster? Well, I don't have a set number for that, but the administrative team needs to be adequate to address what's going on operationally. So while there's not a hard and fast number that at X number of students, that's when you expand your administrative staff, you are having a conversation about, do we have enough administrators to effectively address what we're doing? The physical layout of your campus also is part of that analysis based on, do you have multiple buildings? Are you all consolidated in one space? That can affect that conversation as well. Okay, let's take a look at that vital sign number 1 in a little more detail. Here's the specific vital sign that you'll find in the document I referenced. Faculty salaries are at least 85 to 90% of the local ISD if those salaries are in line with national tables. And basic benefits, health and retirement, are offered to enhance the likelihood of recruiting the quality of faculty and staff that parents expect, comma, here's the big part, or there's a solid plan in place to deal with this vital issue. So if you do this analysis in your school and you realize, oh, wow, we're at 75%. Is that, catastrophic? Not necessarily, but clearly you're not at the vital sign piece. So that's an example where that blood pressure is inching up closer to a number that we don't want to see. And so what do? Well, we develop a plan to deal with it. That may be an annual goal to try to close that delta a little bit to get us to that 85%. But I would start with asking the question, okay, how much time do we need? What can we realistically do right now and in the next couple of years to get us to that 85, 90% piece? So that's an example of how to use the vital signs. MK, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just have something to add in terms of experience. I ran into this early on in my career at my school, and I will tell you that it was a game changer for our school when we made the commitment to do this. And it was very difficult, but it changed the way we viewed interviewing. It changed everything about what we could, how we could recruit. And I know that a lot of times small schools especially think, well, there's no way. There is a way. And it may not happen overnight. It may not happen in 2 years, but the reality is that if you don't make this a priority, the chances of your school growing in the way in which you want it to grow are not very good, in my opinion. And so, I mean, I had this experience, and I do know it's hard, but I can't stress enough how important it is.
Indeed. Okay, let's take a look at another section, another topic that the vital signs address. That would be governance. So again, we spend a lot of time working with schools. Governance is always a little bit tricky in Episcopal schools just because we have lots of different stakeholders that are all committed to the same goal. And so governance can really, really be a source of energy, or governance can be a source of drag. So what can we do to make it a source of energy? Well, 3 vital signs I'd like to identify. Number 9, the board. The board has a clear understanding of what's expected of it. The board also avoids becoming overly involved in the daily operation. Those are 2 little snippets from that vital sign. It's critically important for a board to understand what is in their lane, what is in the head of schools lane, and what's in the shared lane. That's a topic that we spend a lot of time on in board training. If your school board hasn't had any formal board training lately, make sure to reach out to me. Let's talk about that, and let's talk about what resources we can put in your hands to make sure your board clearly understands what's expected of it. Vital sign number 10. This is going to be the one that we explore in a little more detail in just a bit. This is evaluation. So lots of schools are pretty good at doing a head of school evaluation. Fewer schools are as good at doing a board of trustees self-evaluation. We find that high-performing schools are intentional about both. There's a great head of school evaluation process in place that's annual, that's cyclical, that goes on throughout the year as opposed to just a one-time conversation in March or April. And same with the board of trustees too. The board sets goals, and there's a way for the board to assess how it's doing as the governing body. Vital sign number 12 relates to strategic planning and thinking. So we believe that strategic planning is something that should be an ongoing process, not something that happens every 3 years or 5 years. We generate a great binder with great visuals, and then we put them on a bookshelf and we never talk about them again. That would be an example of a worst practice. Best practice would be it's ongoing. If you're in a traditional 3-year cycle, that's great. But what are you doing at maybe every quarter to make sure that that strategic plan continues to be vital and continues to be relevant to the decision making that's happening at the board level? And then finally, a strategic financial plan. It can be the best strategic plan with the best vision and the best goals that you have ever put on paper. But if there's not an accompanying strategic financial plan, what you have is a great wish list without any way to make that happen. So we don't require just a strategic plan. We require also an accompanying strategic financial plan to talk about what are the decisions and the moves we're going to have to make in order to make the vision come true. Okay, let's look at that vital sign number 10 now. And what I want to do with regard to that is talk a little bit about a head support and evaluation committee. If your school does not utilize a head support and evaluation committee, we would encourage you to think about it. So what does this group do? Sometimes if there is not this type of committee, the evaluation of the head of school will fall to the executive council of the board. There's no problem with that. The only potential question with that is that may or may not be the group that has the best skill set to do these kinds of, to conduct these kinds of conversations. Another potential challenge is lots of times the executive committee of a board is so busy with their primary tasks that if they're also tasked with doing the evaluation of the head of school, it tends to fall to the back burner. That's never the result of bad intention. It's just the result of the reality of running a school, particularly in the times that we find ourselves in today. So we like the idea of creating a separate head support and evaluation committee that is tasked solely with providing the head with the support that she or he needs and overseeing the evaluation process. So if you name this type of group, what do they do? Well, the first thing they do, and this normally happens in the summer or right at the start of the year, they sit down with the head of school and they lock into what we call a list of essential expectations. These are the fundamentals that are basically a checklist. Is the head of school leading the faculty? Is the head of school coaching the faculty on instructional practices? Is the head of school being a professional face of the organization? Is the head of school appropriately involved in fundraising? Whatever those kind of base core expectations are, we list those out. But then we get into the goals. Goals should be one or two things, possibly three, that really push the needle forward. Not those essential expectations that are important, don't get me wrong, and they need to be discussed if they're not being met. But this group should also really ask the head to draft 2 or 3 major objectives to bring back to the committee that would be game changers. So examples of those could really be enrollment management, for example. I think enrollment management is going to be the largest conversation our schools are going to have in the next 24 to 36 months, just because of the economic instability we're experiencing right now as a result of the pandemic. I'm hoping that things are going to get back to normal sooner rather than later. But if, for example, you're in a school that was wrestling with admissions or enrollment management during one of the largest economic booms in the history of our country, I think it follows that enrollment management may be a little bit of a challenge in the next coming years as we're experiencing a slowdown in the economy. So there may be a really good objective or goal with regard to enrollment management. But whatever those are, 2 or 3 things tops that the head of school proposes to this committee that are going to really move the needle forward. Then this committee meets, again, this is normally over the summer, but this can be done right now as well, and really, refines those items and locks into those, and then brings those goals to the board. Normally that happens at the first board meeting, but it can happen, at the September meeting or the October meeting if it hasn't been done yet. And then the 5th step is the really critical part. This group periodically meets with the head of school to do 2 things. 1, provide her or him the support they need with this job, because it can be very, very lonely. And 2, asks the question, okay, those 3 things we all identified, how are they coming? What do you need to get those things accomplished? Were we wrong? Did we pick 2 or 3 things that, wow, that's not the important thing. Here's the important thing. Those are the kind of conversations. And they meet just for that type of discussion. Monthly meetings probably make sense initially. I think once this committee gets up and running, the norm tends to be quarterly. It moves to more of a quarterly meeting. Let me stop there and ask Mary Catherine if she has anything she'd like to add.
Well, I just was thinking that I think sometimes this committee focuses too much on evaluation and not enough on support. And I can't stress enough, again, this committee's support, the support piece of this committee really does matter, because we see a lot of times schools will, this committee will go in and they'll do step 1 and step 2, and we'll set it all. And then we just wait until the end, and then we evaluate and we go, well, how'd you do? And the reality is that heads of schools, in a perfect situation, this committee is the committee that really is the listening committee for the head of school to talk about things that they're struggling with, or talk about ways in which they would like to grow personally or grow professionally. And it's a committee that is a trusted voice and a trusted ear to the head of school. And so I think I don't want to sell the support side of the committee, because the evaluation, it's easy. It's kind of black and white. We set the goals, we evaluate, right? Yep. It would be easy, but the support piece is important. And confidentiality, of course, in that committee is vital, because you can't expect the head of school to talk about and the things that they need to talk about if they can't trust the committee. So I just would reiterate how important the support side of this committee.
Yeah. And again, lots of times this work can be done by the executive council, the group of the officers. And I don't think there's anything by definition that makes that wrong or incorrect. I just, again, would suggest whether or not this type of work could be done by a separate group to really free up that executive committee to focus on all of the things that they're dealing with in helping run a school these days. The other reason why it's kind of interesting to do a separate committee is there may be another voice or 2 that you want in those conversations who isn't an officer.
Yeah, I agree.
That can be another board member that may bring some expertise from their work, or if you've got a board member who's also in education. But by defining this work to only be the responsibility of the executive committee. The challenge with that is you may be missing some really good resources that are around your board that need to be involved in these conversations.
Would you include anyone on this committee that might not be on the board?
You know, I've seen that done historically a couple of times and it's worked well. I would say you have to be super, super intentional and careful about that. But one way I've seen that work is when they wanted to bring in another educator, another head of school who was experienced and wanted that person to be involved in these kinds of conversations because without getting too much into the details, it was going to be a couple of years where the goals were going to be really, really tactical, nuts and bolts, education program related. And so they felt like the head really was going to need some support because if anyone knows, as everyone knows, managing change is challenging. Managing change in a school can be especially challenging. And so they really wanted to find a resource of someone who had gone through some of those things, if that makes sense.
Right.
So that voice could be around the table saying, oh my gosh, I understand what you're going through. Here's, yes, try this. Yeah. Or whatever you do, don't do that. I thought that was going to be a great idea too. That didn't work. So yeah, absolutely. In certain circumstances, particularly with some of the things that could be facing a school, you may want to bring in an outside voice. The other thing I like to suggest is really the head should have a say in that.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. The head needs to have some input.
Yeah, the head, I mean, if our goal is to create a committee whose job is not just to evaluate the head, but support the head, then these kind of conversations need to involve the head. I'm not saying the head needs to, I'm not saying the head should have the ability to handpick this committee, but the head sure should have a vote. And the question should be asked, is there anyone else that you'd like for us to consider serving on this committee for some reasons that we may or may not, that may or may not be front of mind for us, but may be really front of mind for you? A board should propose those kinds of questions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that goes back to the whole trust of the committee. It's a very important committee, and the head needs to be able to trust the people on it.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. The next section that I want to talk about with regard to the vital signs, vital sign 13. It's a long one, and it relates to the finances of the school. So it's again towards the end of the document, and then we're going to do a deeper analysis on 13 I, long-term debt. But let me walk through some of these financial vital signs that we think are important. The first is the 120-day rule. So we suggest that high-performing schools are aware of cash on hand and have a minimum of 120 days cash on hand to cover expenses. So pretty straightforward calculation. You take a look at what the operating expenses of the organization are. You divide that by 365, and that gives you what's 1 day of expense for this school. Then you multiply that by 120, and that gives you the amount of reserves that we think are minimum to weather a storm. So again, does that number change throughout the year? Oh yeah. If you really want to do a solid analysis, you do the 120-day analysis at the lowest point of your financial year. That's when it's really telling. Everyone should have way more than 120 days of cash at the start of the year. But figure out when's the lowest point. When, Mary Catherine, when you were in school, yeah, figure out the lowest point of the year, whatever that is for your community, and then ask, how many days of cash do we have on hand? And that's the real way to use that tool. Again, if you're at a point throughout the year where it drips down to 80, don't panic. But if consistently the school doesn't have 120 days of cash on hand, that could be an indicator of what we need to do strategically down the road to make the place as sustainable as possible. Another financial vital sign relates to monthly updates to the board. And this is more just kind of asking the question, how are we reporting finances to the board? And does the full board understand the school's finances and the state of the school financially? So when I work with boards, there's a pretty broad range of board understanding of the finances. So some boards are really on top of this. Some boards, it's pretty obvious that one or two of the board members are on top of the finances, but the rest of the board may or may not really understand. Schools that use a dashboard or a visual depiction of the finances tend to really have more engaged conversations around finances, as opposed to boards that just stick all the financials in the packet and make the assumption that everyone's reading the financials and making the assumption that everyone has enough understanding to be able to read the financials month to month and see a yellow flag. So kind of just where is the board on fully understanding the finances? 13D talks about an audit or a review. So, there's a standard on audit requirement if you're an accredited school based on the size of your school. Most high-performing schools are doing that annual audit, recognizing, however, that we're in some really financially difficult times right now. But the importance of being able to prepare for an audit, as well as the importance of being able to receive what the auditor has to tell us with regard to internal controls, with regard to some of the policies and practices that we have. You don't really get that with the review. You do get that with an audit. So again, this is 120/80 blood pressure. Is every school able to do that? Maybe, maybe not. But from an aspirational perspective, it's something that the school needs to consider. 13E talks about head of school oversight. So is the head of school truly the CEO of the organization? The head of school should not be segregated from any financial information. The head of school should have regular conversations with the business officer and the treasurer of the board. A yellow flag is if these conversations are happening just between the treasurer or just between the treasurer and the business officer, and the head isn't fully involved. Mm-hmm. If that's happening, there's an indicator that the head of school may not truly have oversight of the finances. And so that's an indicator that may be an area of growth. The 80 to 95% hard income question. So this is really asking, are we over-relying on donations and charitable giving? What do we mean by hard income? Hard incomes are things like fees, tuition, things that you know will come in based on your enrollment. That's hard income. What's soft income? Soft income are things that we hope will come in. We may have a track record that they're going to come in, but there's no guarantee they're going to come in. Annual fund dollars are soft income. Charitable giving is soft income. This vital sign asks the question, are you relying too much on soft income? And so what we say is 80 to 95% of what you're bringing in really should be hard income. If less than 80 to 95% of what you're bringing in is tuition, is something other than tuition and fees, that's a problem. There may be, not necessarily, but there may be an indicator that we're over relying on soft income. And if that soft income magically disappears as the result of, a global pandemic, then the school could be in trouble. So we recommend, again, 80 to 95% of what you're bringing in should be hard income. And that tends to be a conversation around what are we charging? What are we paying in compensation? And what's the student-teacher ratio? It tends to be a conversation around those three things. There's really not a lot. Enrollment management, spaces, those kinds of things can play into it as well. But again, that's teacher-student ratio. But there's not a ton of different knobs that you have to adjust that hard income piece. ISM, I just want to put this out there because we respect ISM. ISM disagrees and says you need 100% hard income. You need to figure out what it costs to run your operation, divide that by your enrollment, and that's what you charge in tuition. I think that's too aggressive because also we recognize, we have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have the ability to raise funds. We have the ability to use soft income. So while I don't want my schools to be overly reliant on soft income, I do think that charging 100% is arguably getting into some interesting mission conversations. Mary Catherine, do you have anything to share on
Yeah,
that?
yeah, and I think it's. I mean, of course, everyone would like to do that, but in our association, we have so many. We have a lot of small schools in small towns, and it's just not maybe reasonable. So I mean, of course, we'd all like to do that, but I like kind of what you said about we have the ability because we're Episcopal schools and church schools, we do have a lot of soft money out there that is available to us because people like being a part of the mission that we're offering. And so I think that 80 to 95% is for sure a good vital sign. I don't think that some people can do 100%. I don't know how many can.
So again, at the core, we're asking the school to have a substantive conversation about hard income and where are we? Because some schools couldn't tell me right now what is our percent of hard income. So the first thing is to do that analysis, and then if you do that analysis and you're less than 80%, maybe it's time to have a conversation about that and does that present some potential challenges to sustainability if that soft income were to go away tomorrow. The final one I want to look at deals with long-term debt. So obviously the long-term debt and how much long-term debt you carry is important. This is, again, a fact-sensitive analysis just because there may be strategic reasons for your school to carry some long-term debt. So for that reason, we don't think that all long-term debt is necessarily bad. We think too much long-term debt is bad, and we think long-term debt taken on without the strategic conversation is bad. So there's a strategic reason to take on some long-term debt, great. If we're just taking on long-term debt because we can, that's a challenge. This vital sign talks about how much is too much. So again, this is a kind of a quick and dirty analysis, but it's one way to get your arms around how much debt we have. We think an amount that is less than 1 year's tuition per student is probably manageable. Now, again, there's all sorts of other things to take into consideration, but if you're looking for a way to kind of get a feel and a way to benchmark your debt, this is one way to do it. So again, you take the entire amount of debt that a school carries, you divide that by your enrollment, and you get a number. Compare that number to what you charge in tuition. If it's higher than that number, you may have too much debt. If it's lower than that number, then it may not be, it may be acceptable debt. Let's take a look at a couple of case studies to give you an idea of how this turns out. So the first is a school of 250 kids. They charge $8,000 in annual tuition per kiddo, and they have $1.7 million in debt. We'll say maybe they did a building campaign to expand or update their multi-use facility. We'll say that, multi-use gym. So what you do is you take that 1.7 million, you divide that by 250 kids, and you get $6,800. So basically the amount of debt you're carrying per kiddo is $6,800. If you're charging $8,000 a year in tuition and everything's relatively stable, well, guess what? We think that's probably okay. Let's take a look at the second case, slightly larger school, 315 kids, slightly higher tuition, $9,100 in tuition a year. Long-term debt of $3.4 million. Maybe they built on a new learning facility. Let's take a look at that analysis. So you're going to take that $3.4 million, divide that by 315 kids, the enrollment, you get $10,793. That missed the benchmark. Does that mean it's automatically horrible? Well, not necessarily. Let's say that large debt yielded a whole bunch of new seats, which could eventually turn into additional paying families. So not necessarily, but at that amount, we'd have a conversation about it. One other comment about this, be aware of diocesan benchmarks. Some dioceses also have expectations about how much debt a school or a parish can take, and it may be more restrictive than this. So be aware, you may be in a diocese where that's not the case, but Diocese of Texas, for example, they have a pretty clear understanding of how much debt a school or a church can take on. And it's a slightly different calculation from this. Mary Catherine, anything to add on that?
Well, I was just going to say on this one, it also, when you're doing your analysis, you need to make sure that if you're splitting that debt with the church, for example, then, or with another, if you're in a split situation where it was a combo type of capital campaign, sure, or whatever, then you're not responsible for all of that debt. You're responsible for half that debt. So you want to make sure that when you're doing your analysis that you're acknowledging what you're actually responsible for.
Yeah, I think that's good. So for example, case 2 may be a church and parish that did a joint drive of some variety and decided to finance a portion of it. So yeah, if you're doing that analysis, make sure that you're only analyzing the portion that the school is responsible for. Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, let's stop there. And again, the vital signs have a lot of information, but I also wanted to make sure that we didn't just get too deep into that. But I did want to make sure that you had an opportunity to get a feel for what those are. And then let's have some conversation. So I'm going to stop the recording. So if you're watching this recording, thanks so much for joining us, and let us know if there's anything that we can do to help.